Hi, this is Dr. M.A. Ansari and we are going to discuss the module on communication. This module elaborates on the concept of communication and its significance in our daily life. Then it discusses the factors that acts as barrier to effective communication. The barriers have been categorized in 5 categories such as physical, psychological, cultural, semantic and organizational barriers. And then we go on to describe each one of them in detail.
After going through these modules, the learner should be able to define the concept of communication and effective communication, describe the meaning of barriers to communication, and finally enlist different barriers to effective communication. Now we will discuss barriers to communication. We all know that communication plays a critical role in our life. It helps us to manage our social life as well as social interaction through understanding the people as well as making the people to understand us. Although it is a complex social process, but it is an essential part of human existence. It helps in expressing what we need in order to perform our duties and responsibilities or meet the expectations of people. Therefore, the study of communication is important as well as crucial. Different people have defined communication in different ways depending on the context and situation. We all know that Liggins has defined communication as a process wherein 2 or more than 2 people exchange ideas, facts, feelings or impression in such a way that each gains a common understanding of the meaning, intent and use of message. That definition was given by Liggins in 1961, but later Rogers and Shoemaker in the year 1971 defined communication as the process in which messages are transferred from a source to receiver. Thus we know that we can say communication is a process wherein we seek to develop a mutual understanding and create an environment where effective learning outcomes are achieved. When people communicate, they try to influence their ideas, perceptions and behavior. We know that communication does not occur in vacuum. It occurs with words, but still we can communicate without words. Sometimes we will be able to communicate the meaning or message without using a single word. But for communication to occur, we need what is known as frame of reference. This will lead to a commonness or a degree of commonness among the people with whom we are communicating. Okay, now we define what are the barriers to communication and we will discuss it in detail. As you all know, communication is deemed to be effective when it achieves its objectives. We can conceptualize communication as the one wherein we are able to achieve our predetermined objectives. We communicate for so many purposes. Sometimes we seek information, sometimes we want to give information. No matter how good we make an effort to communicate, often some barriers do affect our acts of communication. In certain situations, we may fail in our attempt to communicate because of several factors, and these factors are known as barriers to communication. Thus, we may define communication barrier as those factors or obstacles which hinder the process of communication. They can be classified into 5 categories such as first, physical or mechanical barriers, 2, psychological barriers, 3, cultural barriers, 4, semantic barriers, and finally 5th, the organizational barriers. The first category of barriers is physical and mechanical barriers. It includes all those factors which physically obstruct the transmission or transfer of message or signal from a sender to the receiver. The example of physical barriers includes, first is noise, We all know there are so many noise going on when we communicate, when we interact with people. This noise is any random or persistent disturbance that obscure, reduces or confuses the message being communicated. It may include any undesired sound or interference during the exchange of information or transmission of signal or its reception at the level of receiver. The noise may be any physical disturbance, any unnecessary sound, physical or at the site of communication or at the level of receiver, particularly in a face-to-face situation in an interpersonal position. Even signal transmission through telephone may also be obstructed through some technical fault in the telephone lines. Communication through mass media may also be obstructed by the disturbances during the transmission of signals, and also in case of radio the same transmission can be obstructed by various other means of sound or other technical problems. So this noise is one factor which very physically distracts or stops the reception of message at the level of receiver, and thereby it helps not in creating a kind of situation where sender and receiver can understand the message. It will, on the other hand, will try to create problem leading to some misunderstanding of the message. So this becomes a barrier. The second barrier is physical disability. The disability of the person, whether he is a sender or receiver, may also become a barrier in certain situation. For example, a person who is either deaf or hard of hearing may face difficulty in receiving the communication. A person who has the habit of stammering may not be able to communicate clearly, as this disability will adversely affect his speech delivery and it will create problems at the level of reception. So to overcome this situation, the communicator has to rely more on the body language. In that way, the sender will have to face the receiver straight on. Use of short and simple sentences, reduce the pace of speech delivery, and making sure that the hearing aids, if any of them is being used by the receiver, are working properly. Third factor is bad or extreme weather conditions. Sometimes the weather may create a situation in which sending and receiving of any message may be negatively affected. This may include extreme weather conditions such as sandstorm, hailstorms, heavy rains, very high or very low temperatures during summers or winter respectively. These adverse climatic conditions will have negative impact on the reception or the ability of the sender to send a message or the ability of the receiver to receive the message. This will not only create physical barriers during the message transfer and reception, but it will also adversely affect the comfort level of the sender and receiver to send or receive any stimulus or give a feedback. Ultimately, what will happen during these extreme weather conditions, the sender or receiver will not feel comfortable and it will act as a barrier. The fourth barrier under the physical category of barriers is choice of medium. If the person is not familiar with the media that he is going to use for communication, this medium itself may become a barrier for the receiver. Alternatively, if the sender is not skilled enough in the use and handling of that media, he will not be able to make good use of media while communicating. So far we have discussed the four physical or mechanical barriers to communication. The second category of barrier is psychological barriers. These include those psychological conditions or situations wherein the transfer of the message and its subsequent interpretation may adversely affect as not intended or unintended by the sender. The examples may include: first, stress; 2, anger; 3, prejudice; 4, attitude; and finally, 5th, inferiority complex. Number 1 is stress. We all know when a person is under stress, his ability to communicate may be different. If he is under stress, his behavior and thinking will not be normal. So consequently, he may intentionally inject something or add some unnecessary words or meaning or display some unruly behavior which may be misunderstood by the receiver. Stress thus may compromise his ability to think, to communicate as well as to receive the message. Second is anger. If a person is angry, his ability to talk and communicate will be compromised. This anger may lead to aggression, which will ultimately affect an individual's capability to communicate. In such mental states, people talk unnecessary things which may involve lots of ordering, threatening, mobilizing, moralizing, and preaching, or sometimes even commanding and directing. The voice and tone of the person who is communicating in an angry state may also be raised very high, which will affect not only his ability to communicate but also adversely affect the receiver's ability to comprehend and understand. The third barrier under this category is prejudice. Friends, we all know this refers to an unreasonable like or dislike or preference of a particular group of person or things over others. It may be the reason for a bias towards person based on the past experience of the person with whom we are communicating or his caste or community. This may consequently affect the ability of a person to communicate or interpret the message properly and impartially. His ability to judge and evaluate something will be thus negatively affected. The fourth barrier is attitude, which can be defined as the mental disposition of a person towards something, whether it is a person or an object. The negative attitude will have an adverse effect on the communication ability of a person to interpret the message received. This may lead to some sort of misunderstandings or give an inappropriate feedback about the message being received or communicated. Fifth barrier is inferiority complex. Friends, we know that many people suffer from the inferiority complex, which is a kind of feeling of inferiority in sender of communication or message. Due to this feeling, the communicator may feel depressed, may have low self-esteem, or may have a fear of failure or rejection. This will ultimately negatively reflected in his ability to communicate, because in this state he will prejudge his actions, his words and his thought, thereby limiting the free and unrestrained flow of communication. Now we come to the third category of barrier, which is cultural barrier. A culture, we all know, is defined as a sum of social heritage. We are grown up in a culture and accordingly we acquire certain habits, certain ways of behavior. Every culture has its own rules and regulations about the acceptable behavior in the society. The norms, values and beliefs are all part of one's culture, and it governs their life and lifestyle. Some of the cultural barriers are discussed hereunder. First, the stereotyping. We know this is a kind of feeling that we have a preconceived notions or image or assumption about a person of how he will behave, what is his background. This tendency among the people of having or prejudging a person, having stereotypical notions about someone, are being biased. This reflects a degree of bias in our communication with that person, and this affects the exchange of information between a sender and a receiver. A very good idea may be ignored by the receiver just because of having a fixed or stereotypical image of a sender, or vice versa, an important message may be lost. Values is another cultural barrier. The different socio-cultural values and behaviors may also create problems in communication. This may be reflected in the patterns of social interactions and building of relationships. So while communicating with people from different cultural backgrounds, we have to ensure it does not go against the values and norms of the people with whom we are communicating. Another cultural barrier is ethnocentrism. This has been defined as the tendency among the people, which is prevalent in everywhere, that people do consider themselves to be superior, consider their culture to be superior to others. This tendency may become a barrier to communication, because if you are interacting with someone and thinking that you are superior and the receiver is inferior, the communication will not take place. This is more so important in the face-to-face situation, because a person can easily judge how you are treating a person. People may just ignore what you want to communicate, or even if you are communicating, they will switch off mentally, leading to breakdown of communication. Fourth cultural barrier is body language. Friends, we know that we not only communicate from mouth using words, we also communicate so much of the meaning and messages through our body language. Body language is like communicating through various parts of the body. Use of appropriate body language can help increase the effectiveness of communication. When we say we communicate through our body, what do we mean? The body language includes eyes contact, facial expressions, head nods, and other kind of symbols which originate from the body. This can affect communication. For example, eye contact or use of certain gestures and posture may not be acceptable in many cultures, and it may be communicating a wrong message which can lead to misunderstanding. For example, in the United States, their culture is when they talk, people look at each other in the eyes while speaking, but in our Indian context, if you are looking into the eyes of the person to whom you are communicating, it may look aggressive or sometimes even sexual if the communication is happening between a male and female person. So we should be very careful about body language in communication. Next group of barriers is what we call semantic barriers. Semantic refers to the meaning that we assign to words, symbols, signs, leading to the formation of concept. A semantic barrier occurs when a person chooses some words or symbols or assign a meaning to them in a way which is not shared by the receiver. The words, the signs and symbols and the meanings are especially coded by the sender, and they may be different or may not be shared in equal measure by the receiver. If it happens, then the communication will not occur. The semantic barriers include, first is language. Friends, we know misunderstandings as well as differences are there common among the people, even though they may speak the same language. Use of appropriate and accurate language is therefore necessary for communication. Language is a type of figurative phrase used to communicate the shared meanings and explain the core concepts and context. We all know that while we are communicating, we are trying to illustrate the context and concept. Typically, we are accustomed to the use of a particular language or its dialect, and if this is not understood by the receiver, it becomes a barrier to communication. Sometimes the regional accents and tones can itself become a barrier to communication. For example, English being spoken by a person from South India will be different than the one being spoken from a person in North India. Still, another difference may be, for example, any native of England, when he or she speak English, it will be different than the one being spoken by a native of Australia or the United States. So, English being the same language but with having different tones and accents, and it bring about differences in the communication of message. So, we have to be very clear while using the language, use the correct words, symbols and sign. Second barrier is use of jargon. What is a jargon? It refers to the technical words which we often use while communicating with people. It usually happens that people working in a specific situation or context uses some technical words or attach meaning to some words which are not universally understood. Therefore, during the process of communication, some of the technical terms or words that we use may be unintentionally used by the sender but may not be understood by the receiver. For example, the word delivery will mean differently to a medical doctor, and it will lead to different meaning to a postman or a courier service boy. So, these words may become barriers to communication and may unintentionally send wrong message. So, it becomes imperative on our part to use proper words and avoid the jargons as far as possible. Next barrier is assumption. In our daily life, we have lots of assumption. Everyone has or makes certain assumptions about a person or a situation. The sender's viewpoint or reference may not be necessarily matched or shared by the receiver, and so this will become a barrier to communication. For example, in a classroom situation, the teacher normally takes it for granted that students know about the basic things or concept, and it would be just sufficient to explain the advanced concepts related to it. However, just telling the students about a new concept may not be enough. You may have to relate it to his prior knowledge, understanding or exposure. These unclarified assumptions thus become a barrier to communication. Next barrier is inappropriate body language. We all know the significance of body language in communication. When we communicate, body language is essentially involved in it, intentionally or unintentionally. Body language is one of the critical and most important component of communication. It may include eye contact, use of gestures and postures, head nods, facial reactions, etc. Good understanding of appropriate, relevant and proper use of body language will greatly facilitate the communication. However, its misuse can result in serious problems and misunderstandings, leading to breakdown of communication. Any difference in the understanding of body language will therefore become a barrier to communication. For example, a sender who is a male person making a long eye contact while communicating with a person who is a female may be misunderstood by the receiver, or use of head nods for seeking approval in a specific way may communicate different meaning to the message. Even use of certain gestures and postures can communicate different meaning during the same episode of communication. It can lead to misunderstandings and it therefore becomes a barrier to communication. Improper and inadequate feedback. We all know, friends, that feedback from the receiver in any form provides an opportunity for the sender to understand and know the fate of the communication as it was communicated. Inadequate and improper feedback from the receiver may create confusion in the mind of sender that the message has either not reached the receiver or not understood by him or her. It may be immediately, as in case of interpersonal communication, or the feedback may be delayed, as in case of communication through mass media. However, if the feedback is not given in time or not directed towards the sender, it may go waste. Therefore, an improper and inadequate feedback will become a barrier to communication. Badly expressed response may also derail the process of communication. And now we come to the fifth category of barriers, which is organizational barrier. The success or failure of an organization is dependent on the effectiveness of communication within the organization. When we are working in an organization, we communicate to various persons working at different levels. The communication is not so simple so as to be universally understood by all. In an organizational context, it may require to communicate different messages or instructions to different people working at different levels of hierarchy in different situations. However, it is not so easy as it may look. The failure to give clear-cut instructions and communication may become a barrier. For example, while a simple head nod by the boss may indicate an approval, a sudden jerk of the same head from the same person will communicate different meaning. The major barriers to communication in an organizational context are: number one, status difference. So while communicating with the people in an organizational, if there is too much difference between the people, it becomes a barrier, as it affects the willingness of the person to communicate. That is why various protocols are followed in an organizational which help in better and effective communication, and it goes a long way in running the organization in a smooth and coordinated manner. Second barrier is poor listening and premature evaluation. While communicating, you should not only be listening to the person but also seen to be listening. This will encourage the person to communicate and share what he or she wants to communicate. And also, do not jump to any conclusion before the person has finished speaking, because if you do so, this will be discouraging. So, poor listening and premature evaluation will become a barrier to communication. Next barrier is gender difference. We all know these days that number of male and female workers are working in team. Men and women, while working and communicating, they adopt different communication styles. The style of communication of a male will be different than that of a female. Inability to understand, respect, and adapt to the differences can limit the scope of communication and frequency of communication. This may have to do something with the behavioral perception as much as gender stereotyping. Thus, gender gaps and traits can become a barrier to communication. It can be critical for organization requiring teamwork. Next barrier is organizational culture. We all know, friends, that every culture has an organization. Number of different cultures are prevailing in different type of organization. If it is an Indian organization, it will have a different culture. If it is a multinational organization, it will have a different culture. It affects the capability as well as loyalty of an individual towards the organization. The openness, the communication climate, the policies and structure within the organization becomes the barrier if they are not well suited to the needs of the people they are working. That's why it becomes a barrier for communicating within the organization. Next barrier is information overload. In today's information society, we have the tendency to collect lots of information. Besides, too much of information being communicated too frequently to an individual over a period of time creates a problem of plenty. This is also known as information overload. If a person is burdened with lots of messages and responsibility, it may lead to poor communication. Next barrier is interpersonal mistrust among the employees. We all know different kind of persons are working in an organization. For any organization to be successful, the degree of interpersonal trust is very necessary. In its absence, the sender or receiver will derive different or opposite meaning and the communication will become meaningless. So, lack of trust may create a credibility problem for the organization and this will lead to problem of communication breakdown. So, friends, now we have seen different kinds of barriers that affect our ability to communicate and also ability to receive. Now, we will discuss how to overcome these barriers to communication. We all know that everyone desires to communicate effectively and efficiently, but do not make efforts to overcome the barriers to communication. Consequently, it leads to failure of communication or frequent breakdown of communication. Simply taking note of these barriers will not be enough, but making a conscious and deliberate effort to overcome them will bring some sort of desired result. These barriers can distort a message or misrepresent the intention of the sender, leading to misunderstanding or failure of communication. Thus, any task or transaction which requires more than one person to be involved in this communication will be successful if we take into account these barriers to communication. In order to actively avoid these barriers, we should do the following activities. First, be a good listener. One must not only listen carefully but should also seem to be listening, because this will encourage the person to speak out more. Learn to listen and listen to learn. Paraphrase something when it is being said by the person, as it will be helping the person to communicate or speak more. Second, that messages communicated should be consistent with the receiver's past experience and exposure. Besides, proper encoding and treatment of message will go a long way to enable the receiver to understand or comprehend it effectively. Third, clarify the ideas before communicating. Nothing should be taken for granted when you are talking to people. Fourth, communication according to the needs of the target audience is very good. If you are communicating to the person according to the needs, then the message will be easily comprehended, understood. No information overload will be there. Fifth, use of appropriate language which is easy to understand. Process of communication needs to be planned very carefully and meticulously. Remember, effective communication is a conscious and deliberate attempt. And last one, that ensure proper feedback. When you are communicating, provide enough opportunities for the adequate and timely feedback from the target receiver. Ensure to attend to the feedback and resolve the issue if any. Proper follow-up is necessary. So, by adopting these strategies, the barriers to communication can be effectively overcome by the communicator. This will lead to an efficient and effective communication.
So, friends, before we conclude, let us look back and summarize what has been discussed so far. We have described that communication is a process of social interaction through which we exchange opinion, share our emotions or feelings, and transmit the ideas. It helps in creating a mutual understanding and space in the society to conduct ourselves and our business. The purpose of communication will not be achieved if receiver fails to understand the meaning, intent, and purpose of communication as intended by the sender of message. However, in this process may be adversely affected by some factors which we have described them as barriers to communication. Barriers are those factors or obstacles which hinder the process of communication. These barriers to communication were classified into 5 categories: physical, psychological, cultural, semantic, and organizational barriers. The physical barriers includes noise, physical disability, bad or extreme weather conditions, and skill to use the media. The psychological barriers discussed were anger, stress, prejudice, attitude, inferiority complex. The cultural barriers were stereotyping, values, ethnocentrism, and body language. The semantic barriers included use of language, use of jargons, assumptions, body language, and feedback. And lastly, the organizational barriers discussed were the status and gender differences, information overload, organizational culture, interpersonal trust among the employees, and poor listening and premature evaluation. If we take note of these barriers during our communication, we will definitely be successful in achieving the goals of communication. Thank you very much.